As the war in Ukraine continues to rage on, the eyes of the British government's focused on 2 British men sentenced to death by Donetsk's separatists. Boris Johnson has ordered ministers to do everything in their power to secure the release of Aidan Aslin and Sean Pinner. Meanwhile, Britain and the US are stepping up the supply of more powerful weapons to Ukraine. With us is Jim Townsend, Senior Fellow at the Centre for a New American Security, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank. Good evening to you, Jim. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you. Good evening to you.
How much power, Jim, does this situation with these 2 British men sentenced to death in Russian-occupied Ukraine hand to the Kremlin?
Well, it's a lot of power. It's quite a bit of leverage, and the Russians know how to use it. Those are valuable prisoners to them, I would think. There are prisoners certainly held by Ukraine. Russia has its mercenaries themselves that probably have been captured by Ukraine. I can imagine that Russia is going to keep these prisoners, intimidating them and intimidating the UK and the Americans and others with their threats about death sentences. But I think they're going to keep them until they can find a way to exchange them for something valuable to the Russians. They're too valuable to go out and execute them that way. I think they're going to keep them and try to trade for something that the Russians want.
I mentioned in the introduction to this that whilst this is happening, Britain and the US both stepping up their supply of more powerful weapons to Ukraine. And you do wonder, with all of this going on, these men being found guilty of terrorism by a pro-Kremlin Donetsk court, where this leaves the options available to the UK and the US and the role it has to play in this affair. What are the options?
Well, I think there's one overriding option, and that is we've got to help Ukraine to hold the line in the Donetsk area, in the Donbass. This is something that is critical for Russia. If we're not able to help Ukraine hold and maybe even push back on the Russians, then we're going to find ourselves in a very bad situation with Russia on the march. And it's something that right now, in the next couple of weeks, next month, we're going to see if the tide turns or not in the Russians' favor, or whether the Ukrainians will be able to hold the line. And this equipment that the Americans and the Brits and the others are now rushing in, this long-range artillery, is critical to this. And so in terms of options, this is really something we're going to have to do. At the same time, we can try to work to win the release of those British citizens. And I hope that whether it's the US or UK, all of us try to find a way to get them out. But in terms of what we've got ahead of us, we've got to keep supplying Ukraine. They're at a tenuous position right now, and we've got to keep this resupply going.
There's talk of this hostage situation being an opportunity for the Kremlin to force the West to relax sanctions against Russia. Do you think there's some truth in this?
Well, I think what we're seeing right now in terms of the food supply, which I know your radio has been talking quite a bit about, use of food as a weapon by the Russians. That's what they're doing right now. In terms of leverage, we know that whether it's the prisoners that they now have from the UK or whether it's food, they're going to use whatever leverage they feel they have to try to overturn these sanctions. The European Union is having to deal with this too in terms of energy, and the UK demanding rubles and this type of thing. The UK is going to use whatever leverage they have, and the major leverage they're trying to use right now is famine. Keeping food back by not allowing ships to sail to feed people who are starving, but also they're going to use these prisoners as well. These prisoners that have been captured by the Russians. They're going to use whatever leverage they can because they know that their back's a bit to the wall as well. They're not doing so well in Ukraine, and so if this is some leverage, they're going to use it.
I'm keen to hear your thoughts, your analysis on the stage that things are at. And I ask that as the situation is looking incredibly bleak for Ukraine. We're hearing Russian forces arming warships with surface-to-air missiles to combat these more powerful weapons being supplied by Brits and Americans. And reports of Russian troops laying mines from the 1950s to prevent any counterattacks by Ukrainian forces in the south. What's your analysis of where the war currently is?
Well, I think we're no longer in that stage that we took such hope with when it was the Battle of Kyiv, and the Ukrainians were able to push back the Russians off of that phase, that first phase of their offensive. The second phase, there in the Donbass, there's been some victories as well for Ukraine there, particularly in the early days. But the Russians have adapted. The Russians are now using these brutal tactics that are very familiar to people who know World War One, where the Germans used artillery and so did the Allies to pound away before launching on offensive. And we're seeing this right now. These overwhelming superiority that the Russians have in artillery and the way they use it to flatten a city before they even send in their forces, to hammer away at the Ukraine defenses in their own trenches. And we've been seeing that exercise over the past few weeks to devastating effect. We haven't seen massive offensive victories by the Russians, but we see what they're doing. And it's this war of attrition where they're chipping away, bombarding away, killing civilians. And that's what they're going to do as they steadily push back Ukraine, which does not have the number of forces that Russia potentially has. And they don't have the artillery with the ranges that the Russians have. And that's why what the Brits are doing and what the U.S. are doing to try to get them some artillery with a longer range, it's so important. But it's going to take some time to get there because of the training required and this type of thing, which is why Ukraine has got to hold on. So the bottom line, to answer your question, is a lot of the hope and a lot of the effectiveness that we have seen in the past with Ukraine taking advantage of Russian mistakes, that's receding a bit. And the Russians are now using this barbaric tactic of artillery to flatten anything ahead of them. And they're using that to effect. And we've just got to pray for Ukraine to hang in there.
How much does this suggest that the money spent by the British government, by the US, and the wider international community arming Ukraine has somewhat been in vain?
Well, it's not in vain at all. I think what we've been able to do is buy Ukraine time to arm themselves and get themselves in a place where they can hold back Russia, which they have been doing. It's gotten harder now, as I've said. But we were able to do that, and we were able to force on Putin the understanding that it wasn't going to be a cakewalk for Russian forces to go in and capture Kyiv and Zelensky and to turn that over to a satellite, if you will, of Russia. We were able to show the world that unity against Russia, unity against Putin is effective. And that we've got to stay unified. And so I think this is absolutely not in vain. We have shown this. We have shown that the world is arrayed against him. Certainly the transatlantic alliance is NATO and all of the partners to NATO. We're showing Putin that his assumptions were wrong. His assumptions were wrong about NATO, about Europe, about the United States. They were wrong about the Ukrainians' willingness to give their lives up for their country. And so we also showed him that his military isn't as good as he was told it is. So this was not in vain. And I feel that we've got a great ability here. If we can get the long-range artillery in there and continue to supply ammunition and this type of thing, we're going to be able to force Putin to the negotiating table without that strong hand that he might have had we not been able to supply Ukraine and Ukraine wasn't fighting as well as it is. So it's gotten tough, and we can't fool ourselves that it won't get tougher. But that means we have to stay more unified, and that means we have to make sure we get the arms and assistance into Ukraine that they're going to need.
Yeah, just finally, keen to hear your thoughts on the story we're hearing in Mariupol, where there are fears of a possible cholera outbreak. The mayor is warning uncollected corpses combined with higher temperatures are contaminating wells in the area. Bearing in mind, having just come through one pandemic, how worried should we be about this latest development?
Well, I think we have to be worried for the people of Mariupol and other towns that the Russians might take, because it's obvious to all of us who are watching this, the Russians don't care about the civilian population. They don't care about their own forces, quite frankly. And now they've got some big problems to deal with in Mariupol and other places, some of these smaller villages that they've begun to take in the Donbass. They are the ones that are going to be responsible for a humanitarian tragedy, whether it's cholera or whatever it might be. They have now taken these places, and they're now responsible for those civilian lives there. I fear that the heartlessness and the barbarity that we've seen with the Russian forces, I'm not hopeful, that a lot will be done. Although we can certainly pressure and force the Russians as best we can in the West. I'm not sure who Putin listens to, but they have got to have a heart and understand that they are now responsible for controlling this cholera outbreak and anything else in these towns. I think as far as the United Kingdom or the United States or other parts of Europe, I don't think these sicknesses and illnesses, we will find them in our societies, unlike, say, the pandemic. But it is something that we need to understand, that we've got to put pressure on Russia, and we've got to come up with a humanitarian approach where we can at least get the United Nations or some of the other NGOs that might be able to do humanitarian work to get into Mariupol. If the Russians won't handle the humanitarian catastrophe there, we have to do that out of the West, using the UN or the Red Cross or whoever we can get into those towns. And the Russians need to cooperate. So, frankly, we can't lay back and say, well, this isn't going to impact us. But it does impact us in terms of what we can do to help. And we need to be working that right now through the UN, through the Red Cross, to get the Russians to give us a humanitarian corridor into these towns to try to stem this tragedy.
Okay, Jim, really good to get your thoughts. Thank you for joining us. Jim Townsend, the Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Security, a Washington, D.C. based think tank.